Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com, and this is our 29th episode. Nima, what's with this MMT garbage?
Yeah, that's what we will discuss today, I guess.
And, you know, I guess we should preface this by saying we should make the official announcement, because we've been reading from FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, and this will be our third episode doing this. And I think this might be the fifth article that we've gone over, and we'll be going over two of them now. And we have actually officially been reconverted out of MMT because of reading these articles. We have to submit that it's official, it's over, we're done with MMT. FEE.com or FEE.org has convinced us otherwise.
That's what our April 1st episode would have sounded like.
Yeah. But we missed it. Sorry, guys. Anyway, no, it's more of the same trash talking bullshit. We are going to go through two articles again and see what FEE's typist monkeys have been pounding out for us to make fun of, because we actually have a lot of great fun doing this. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into this first article, because at this point, I don't even know what the explanation is, other than this stuff is so mainstream media tabloid hokiness that we could just sit here and make jokes about it. So the first one, links to these articles, of course, will be in the description below, is Modern Monetary Theory, debunking the latest incarnation of government's magic money tree. Nima, spot the fallacy.
That's poisoning the well.
I think there's a non sequitur straw man all wrapped up in here too. Because it didn't actually say that modern monetary theory is the latest incarnations of the government's magic money tree. It's just kind of set up for you to assume it. Right. So the subtitle...
It's trying to sneak it in on you.
So the subtitle: economists have always known that a government has three sources of money. It can tax it, borrow it, or print it.
Yeah, well... And it actually always prints it in a sovereign money system.
In January, the Congressional Budget Office released its budget and economic outlook for 2019 to 2029. It's horrific reading. Horrific. Federal budget deficits are projected to rise from $779 billion annually to $1.37 trillion over the next 10 years. It's horrific, Nima. Federal government debt will rise to 93% of GDP by 2029, its highest level since just after World War II. Nima, there was an interesting economic situation that happened due to World War II. Can you remember what that was?
Yeah, well, World War II flooded the market with government debt or government bonds, and thus there was... Huh?
Because there was some very important historical thing that happened right before World War II. What was that? That like from like the 30s started at the end. Depression. Oh yeah, that thing. I wonder if there's a coincidence that the highest level of deficit to GDP spending since the end of World War II, it would be and 2029 if I'm sorry, I'm not making this come out very clear. Yeah, as you were about to explain, the fact that the government had been pumping in all this government debt to fight the war was the thing that pulled us out of the Great Depression.
Well, in part, and it was basically the foundation for a very prolonged economic period of stability and a pretty significant boom post-World War II, which is because the private sector was not highly leveraged, and there was a lot of safe assets, namely reserves and government securities, that were available to the private sector, and the private debt load was, was very low, which is really what matters most to the economy, more to the economy, or that is the debt to watch as far as impact on the economy, and that was pretty low compared to recent numbers in terms of leverage. But it wasn't necessarily a bad thing that there was a lot of government debt. It's just the point.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess we'll have some time to hammer on that as we get through the article. I'll continue. It has been forecast to be about 150% of GDP in 2049, far higher than it has ever been. On top of this, politicians have been announcing grand schemes for further spending. $47 billion on free college tuition, $1 trillion for new infrastructure, $1.4 trillion to write off student loan debt, at least $7 trillion on a Green New Deal, $32 trillion on Medicare for all. By one estimate, these new proposals totaled an estimated $42.5 trillion over the next decade.
Yeah, that's not good, and we agree with them probably on that. So, but it doesn't have anything to do with MMT per se. So
it doesn't. And then I would like to put this in here. I do support writing off the student loan debt.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I also support students should be allowed to declare bankruptcy.
Or that. That's a happy medium, I think. And although I do support the student loan debt simply on the principle that I think society / the government owes every student that went to college a most sincere apology for tricking them into thinking that that was a good use of their money.
Yeah.
And putting them into debt slavery to the sense that they can't bankrupt out of it. And are you reading these articles that are coming out where it's like, if you don't pay your student loans, you can't get a driver's license in some states?
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. It's brutal. There's no way to write it off. It's one of the few debts that you can't discharge.
Yeah.
So I can totally see it.
Modern day debt slavery.
While we're at it, the government should also pay reparations for all the molestation and abuse that they've put the children of the country through via the public schooling system.
That is, I'll agree with that one as well. But before, I guess, you and I get into our politics, what exactly MMT should be doing, let's go on the article. So, adding these new spending proposals to the flood of red ink. I love the inflammatory language of these guys. So adding these new spending proposals to the flood of red ink, the CBO, that was the Congressional Budget Office, projects just from the following current path. The federal government is set to face a serious fiscal crisis in the not-too-distant future. The spirit of what is it, Peter Schiff?
Yeah.
I've been hearing a lot about Adam Schiff lately.
There's always some fiscal crisis looming, right? And it's always in the not too distant future, and it's never really clear how exactly it's going to shake out. I think to a lot of people, or how it's supposed to go down.
But never fear, the printing press is here, or perhaps not. According to modern monetary theory, MMT, a newly prominent idea supported by the likes of Representative Ocasio-Cortez, we don't have to worry. MMT starts with the observation that a government prints the currency it borrows in Wait. MMT starts with the observation that a government which prints the currency it borrows in cannot become insolvent. I don't think that's a proper sentence. It can always print as much money as it needs to cover any liabilities. So governments don't print in the currency that they borrow in. That doesn't make sense. Governments who are monetarily sovereign, like the United States, they just print the money.
Yeah. They create money by spending, and then they offer bonds for people who want to earn risk-free interest, as we've discussed before. Yeah.
This is true, but hardly groundbreaking. The article goes on. Economists have always known that a government has three sources of money. It can tax it, borrow it, or print it. Well, this gets us back to the subtitle, and like Nima said at the beginning.
Well, that's why he repeated that. But it's basically, technically, a sovereign government always prints money, and then they choose to tax some of it out of existence later on, and they choose to sell bonds later on, or as he calls it, borrow it. But it's really not borrowing. It's just offering risk-free interest vehicles.
Well, and I want to analyze the logical progression here. So, in the previous paragraph, it says, okay, so according to MMT, which is supported by the likes of Ocasio-Cortez, and we're supposed to just simply understand that poisons the well, MMT starts with the observation that the government can simply print money. And then so that's one of the three ways that it's about to say. And then it says, economists have always known that that the government can tax, borrow, or print. Well, which is it? Is MMT saying that the government can always print money?
Print. Yeah, he's saying that
they're flipping back and forth here.
He's saying MMT is not new because economists have always known that it can also print as a source in addition to taxing and borrowing. But the new insight is that to me at least, the new side of MMT was that it's the default state or the default process of a sovereign government is to first print money and then tax it out of existence later on. There's really no borrowing going on. It's just a voluntary sales of risk-free interest securities. So all these words that he lists there, tax, borrow, and print, they don't really mean what you think they mean. I think that is the important insight of MMT.
Of course. Going on. If a government starts printing money to pay its bills, there is no guarantee the money will be worth anything. Nima, there's no guarantee. Or wait, what's that guarantee called?
Well, it's because
the violence of the state?
Yeah, because the government levies taxes in that medium of exchange. That is, in a way, the guarantee that the money will be worth something. Now, if the government loses its power to enforce taxes, then you may have a problem indeed. But then we have other problems at that point.
So far, all MMT amounts to is that you don't need to worry about turning into Greece if you could turn yourself into Zimbabwe instead. Oh, Nima, that was so clever. We need to buy a plane ticket and find this guy to pat him on the back. He managed to subtly say hyperinflation twice in one sentence.
Well, Greece is deep. I think it's more like hyperdepression, and Zimbabwe is supposed to be hyperinflation.
Well, aren't they? Have they been predicting hyperinflation for Greece, or they just predict hyperinflation for everything?
I don't think they've predicted hyperinflation for Greece, but They may well have. I mean, yeah, you're right. They predict hyperinflation for anyone in any system at any time.
Okay, so I guess I get their point, which he's saying. So Greece has had austerity forced upon it, essentially, and they're saying, well, you could avoid having austerity forced on you because you could simply go crazy and have hyperinflation instead. Well, so it's a false dichotomy.
What he's saying is that since Greece had a default on their debt, that is a problem. But the other... So if Greece were to print money to pay off the debt, then that would be doing what Zimbabwe did in his mind. And so the choice becomes, do we have a depression like Greece had and arguably is maybe just temporarily taking a hiatus from right now, or do we choose the hyperinflationary path Zimbabwe chose by apparently printing money to pay off their debts, which he thinks that's the source of the Zimbabwe hyperinflation. As we've discussed before, if we want to get into Zimbabwe real quick, or any hyperinflations in history, in fact, they've not really been related to or caused by monetary or events, but rather by political events. In the case of Zimbabwe, it was a big land reform that took land away from people who knew how to work on it and gave it to people who had no clue what they were doing. A lot of them were raiding the land, and the productive capacity of the country collapsed. And when productive capacity collapses, that's oftentimes when you see hyperinflation, as we've seen in Zimbabwe, as we've seen in Weimar Germany, where their productive capacity was literally taken from the Germans at gunpoint by troops that marched in from the West. And the case of Greece is actually a situation that MMTers have explained better than anyone else, in my opinion, because the European Union imposes a deficit limit, a 3% deficit limit. The countries who import more than they export, in other words, who run a current account deficit, they ran into big trouble because they had to balance their national government budgets, even though the current account deficit was sucking net private savings out of the country. And MMT explains that you need a certain amount of net private savings in the country, and net private savings equals the current account surplus plus the government budget deficit. So if a country can run a large current account surplus, then they can, for example, afford to run a balanced national government budget because they obtain net private savings through the export surplus or to the current account surplus. But if the country is in a state of running a current account deficit, then that deducts net private savings from the private sector. The only other possible source for net private savings is the federal government's budget deficit, as we've discussed many times before. So a country that runs a current account deficit needs to run a budget deficit, and you see that in the U.S., for example. The U.S. is still running a pretty large current account deficit, so they run a federal government budget deficit to make up for that, and then some, in order to have net private savings in the economy.
Yep.
All these countries in Europe, Greece, Portugal, Spain, that ran into high unemployment, ran into trouble in the European crisis, they are all net importers, and they all run a current account deficit. So they kind of depend on a federal government budget deficit to supply net private savings to the private sector. So all those countries struggled, particularly during the Euro crisis. And all the countries that are running current account surpluses, they don't need to run a government budget deficit. So they lecture all the net importer countries about how undisciplined they are. And look at us, we can balance our budget, but at the same time, we're
taking all your money.
Taking your money, exactly. That's exactly what's going on in Europe, yeah.
Why don't you have enough money? We're doing just fine. What's your problem?
Yeah. The IMF imposed austerity on Greece, and that was pretty bad for the Greek economy. I mean, the amount of economic growth and production they've lost out on over the years is pretty significant. And it was unnecessary. They wouldn't have had to do austerity. They didn't need to have a 3% budget rule unless you want to say from the standpoint of the EU technocrats who want to starve off certain areas of their empire and who want to control the people in their empire. From their standpoint, it's probably certainly a pretty viable tool to impose austerity on.
Yeah, you can just change a few numbers and kill everybody.
Yeah,
what a great tool.
That's what they're doing. Yeah.
So we're still in the middle of this paragraph. I want to move on, and this next sentence is blowing my mind. So I'm going to reread. I want to reread the paragraph so we get the full context of the sentence. So, going back, of course, if a government starts printing money to pay its bills, there is no guarantee the money will be worth anything. So far, all MMT amounts to is that you don't need to worry about turning into Greece if you can turn yourself into Zimbabwe instead. This is why economists have been wary of monetary financing of fiscal policy, except in wartime. What?
Yeah, so
all these rules that you're telling me don't matter as long as we're blowing shit up?
Yeah. Monetary financing of fiscal policy is kind of meaningless. You know, people always get very, very excited when the Federal Reserve purchases government bonds and thus injects reserves into the economy. But in reality, that's just a return to the default state, to the way the economy should be running, which is there's no interest paid on risk-free investments. Or at the very least, there's a very low interest rate that never changes paid on risk-free investments. If you subsidize people with money by paying them a risk-free rate, then that is government intervention, and that is the abnormal state. What he's suggesting here is that when central banks buy up government treasury bonds, which is what monetary financing of fiscal policy means, that is an abnormal thing, or that is a bad thing. But in reality, it's just returning to the default state. And we've seen this, you know, a lot of these people, I bet this guy predicted hyperinflation when the Fed started QE or whatever, because that's exactly what it is, monetary financing of fiscal policy. But, or it's really what he's referring to. It's not, I don't agree with the choice of words. But in reality, it wasn't a big impact, really. It was insignificant at best. And it was just a private sector asset swap that didn't really cause much problems or benefits in the long run, or short run, actually.
Moving on. Indeed, when the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business surveyed a group of economists recently on the questions, countries that borrow with their own currency should not worry about government deficits because they can always create money to finance their debt, and countries that borrow in their own currency can finance as much real government spending as they want by creating money, not a single one of them agreed with either statement. Well, Nima, all economists agree.
Yeah,
they all agree.
97% of economics scientists agree.
Well, and then, of course, these questions are just totally straw man, right?
Well, yeah, because MMT doesn't say that deficits don't matter. It just says that they don't matter in the way that you think they do.
And then, although the second one has me a little bit confused, countries that borrow in their own currency can finance as much real government spending as they want by creating money. That doesn't even make sense.
Spending as they want by creating money.
What's real? What's fake government spending? Real government spending versus fake government spending?
Well, I think real versus nominal. So probably real is probably adjusted for inflation would be my guess. But can finance as much real? Well, I mean, again, it's not really true, because if the government goes overboard, the deficit grows too large, and inflation begins picking up because we're in a full employment economy, then the pricing mechanism is what constrains the government. So technically, I guess I would not necessarily agree with that second statement, the way I read it at least. But I don't really think you know. Okay, so a couple of economists said something is basically the gist of his
correct
paragraph there. So.
What are the few useful equations in economics? Ooh, we're going to learn something, Nima. MMTers say this worry is misplaced. To see why, Look at the equation of exchange below, one of the few genuinely useful equations in economics. MV equals PY. This says the money supply in an economy, M, multiplied by the number of times it is spent in a given period, V, also known as velocity of circulation, equals the price level, P, multiplied by output, Y. Again, this is a truism. It simply says that nominal spending, or aggregate demand, which is MV, the left side of the equation, equals nominal income, PY, the right side of the equation. As all spending is someone else's income, this is true by definition.
Yeah.
But the equation becomes more interesting when we make assumptions about its component variables. If we assume that y is fixed by real factors, and y being the output.
The output, yeah.
And v is constant, which is the velocity, how many times people are spending money, which they said is the old monetarist assumptions. It follows that any increase or decrease in money supply must be offset by an increase or decrease in price. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, as Milton Friedman argued. In this case, the increase in the money supply, M, MMT's proposal simply raised prices, P, inflation, in other words.
In this case, in this scenario that he manufactured for himself there, where output is constant and velocity is constant, then he would be right. But
there's no such thing.
There's no reason to believe that that is the case, and it's not. And so it's kind of, irrelevant, I think, what this formula says, because the output could go up too, and then will go up if there's unemployment. And if there are unused resources in the economy, such as, for example, the U.S. economy, industry utilization is at something like 75% or something like that. Maybe it's gone up under Trump a little bit now. But it's far from being fully utilized. And unemployment is still pretty high, even though official unemployment is at 3.8%. I believe the U6 rate is still at something like 9.5%. Still a lot of people who are working multiple jobs to make ends meet. So it's not true that output would be constant if the government expanded their budget deficit. If that was the case, then sure, then we would have inflation. But that's a big if.
Well, and one thing that irritates me about an equation like this, and I'm no economist over here. In fact, I've never taken an class on economics, whether that was in high school or in college, in my life. Although I feel like that's not to my detriment, is that this utterly takes out any emotional aspect of people's purchasing decisions. And I understand, like, if you're looking at stock market purchases or bond purchases or treasuries or whatever, that there's kind of this auction effect, and people are going to gobble up as much as they can at the lowest price possible. But in most day-to-day purchasing that you or I do when we're going about our day, we don't do it based on that, like, auction premises. We do it based on our emotions.
Yeah, but that doesn't that doesn't invalidate the equation up there. The equation is still valid. It's just that the assumptions he makes are invalid, I would say.
Okay, well, I'll keep going instead of making assertions that can't really be proven. So, we can escape this trap, MMTers argue, by tinkering with the other variables. It's tinkering, Nima. Increasing output is tinkering with a variable.
Yeah, I guess he got me there.
Velocity of circulation is perhaps the trickiest one conceptually. One way to think of it is as the inverse of the demand to hold money. If your desire to hold money increases, you might be saving for a rainy day. You will not spend it, and your velocity of circulation will decrease. This will offset to some extent any increase in the money supply.
Yeah, because, for example, this is exactly what happened in 2008, where consumption collapsed, economic crisis, recession happened, and people weren't as keen on spending money but wanted to hold their money, so the velocity of money would probably decrease in that scenario. So tinkering, I mean, it's a reality. This is what happens in certain situations where, you can expand government spending, but if velocity, like you could expand the money supply through government spending, but the velocity can come down at the same time. So then the net effect remains zero in the end. So I guess he calls that tinkering, but it's actually a very real scenario that is relevant. It needs to be understood and explained and discussed. And let's see what else he has to say.
Sure. MMTers propose to use this to control inflation. As inflation accelerates, people's demand to hold money decreases, as they try to spend it before its purchasing power erodes. This drives up V, the velocity, and accelerates inflation even further. But the government can impose a higher tax burden, which must be paid in the depreciating currency, and people will need currency to cover this. By increasing taxes, the government can increase the money demand, or at least slow the velocity of circulation. This is the core of MMT as a policy. Higher government spending funded by printing money, and the use of higher taxes to deal with any resulting inflation. Oh, it's like we talked about this last time.
Well, yeah, I mean, this guy probably read the other guy's article about taxes, and it's not really a particularly important cornerstone of MMT theory. Dylan and I, we don't propose that the government raise taxes if we encounter inflation, but rather just cut spending and stop expanding the budget deficit. MMT just says that something can be done about inflation. One thing is to raise taxes because that reduces the money, that reduces net private saving. And the other thing is to expand government spending. To reduce government spending, which would also reduce net private saving. And in a scenario where all resources are utilized and we're starting to see inflation because the government is bidding private sector resources out of the private sector, then theoretically those two are both methods to reduce inflation. But wherever you stand politically is kind of up to you. I happen to believe that the government should just cut their spending. Other people would probably say, well, why don't we just tax the rich? Both methods work, but different political spectrums prefer different courses of action, and MMT is policy agnostic. MMT just tells you what will happen if you do one thing or the other.
Yep. Going on. For MMTers, Friedman is dead wrong. Inflation is never and nowhere a monetary phenomenon. Ooh, never and nowhere, Nima. Yeah. As the picture below argues, inflation is the result of either a failure to manipulate the velocity, like the U.S. Confederacy, or a collapse in output, like Zimbabwe or Venezuela. Needless to say, historically, these explanations are scarcely credible. Well, it's needless to say, Nima, so I guess there's no reason to prove it.
He just makes that up. I love that. He just squeezes in that sentence as if that's proving anything.
So the image below is from the Deficit Owls, and it says the common causes of hyperinflation are: 1. Government loses its ability to enforce taxes, like the U.S. Confederacy.
Yes, 2, that caused hyperinflation, indeed.
2. large foreign denominated debt like Weimar Germany.
Yeah, plus your entire productive capacity destroyed. And, well, okay, that's an exaggeration. But you have troops marching in from the west, forcing your workers to dig up coal for them at gunpoint, and the coal we shipped out of the country. So that's these are all things that reduce the availability of productive factors in the economy, and that's what led to the Weimar Germany hyperinflation. And same in, he says there, number 3, severe shortage of goods, Zimbabwe and Venezuela. In Venezuela, I would argue we don't really know how much the effect of the U.S. Imposed sanctions actually are, but I bet they're significant. So, again, these are all political causes of hyperinflation.
But needless to say, historically, these examples are scarcely credible.
Right.
I'm not going to tell you why, because it's needless to say. Needless to say.
His work here is done, yeah.
There is no reason to believe that MMTers would be able to control inflation by the methods they suggest. I'm not going to explain why. Imagine a government operating on MMT lines. Just imagine it, Nima. Imagine a government operating on MMT lines as if every single government on Earth doesn't do so already.
Yeah, that's pretty important to point out. It's not like we're saying governments need to adopt MMT. MMT just recognizes how the financial system actually works.
Imagine a government operating on MMT lines. It prints money and spends it. Prices start to rise. The government raises taxes. This takes time. The passage of a tax bill, as opposed to the relatively quick expedient of selling securities, which central banks do when they want to accomplish the same aim. Even if passed, this tax hike reduces output, exacerbating the problem.
Yeah, so let's not hike taxes. Agreed.
Yeah, and I thought we were, like, central banks, we've been over this so many times. So the central banks aren't controlling the money supply.
No, they don't. The private banks do, and that's not controlling because they're individual entities who lend money when they find willing and able borrowers, and that determines whether or not the money supply increases more than anything.
And they do so via the rules and licensing set out to them by the government.
Yes.
Furthermore, to make money out of the economy, to make money out of the economy, the government... To take money out of the economy, the government would have to run the sort of budget surplus MMT is predicated on freeing it from. The money raised by these high taxes, assuming they brought it in, could not be spent or redistributed. It has to be destroyed if the money supply is to be reduced. As British inflation hit 26% in the 1970s, the government tried to all manner of taxes to sop up excess purchasing power without any noticeable successes.
Well, in the 1970s, we had an oil embargo that raised the price for oil to over $100, which are levels I believe never before seen. Or was it over 50 or whatever? But it went up from like $2 to very high levels. And that's a very basic commodity that's used in almost anything, and at the very least in the production of anything. So even if the retail store needs to pay more for the logistics companies because they need to pay more for gas, and all the goods in their stores get more expensive. So an inflation that is induced via a commodity price monopolist's pricing decisions cannot be combated by raising taxes or doing anything else for that matter. It would have to technically, if we're so into the free market, we have to accept that that's what's going to happen. The prices adjust to the market conditions, which if a monopoly price setter raises their price, then there's going to be a price shock rippling through the economy. It would be a one-time shock, and it would be absorbed by the economy, and then the economy could move on from there. But of course, then they start doing these silly things like raising taxes to combat that or whatever. At least that's what he supposes here. So then that causes all sorts of other problems, and then before you know, you end up in a recession. And it was, in the U.S. in the 1970s, they also tried to raise rates throughout the 70s till the early 80s. Interest rates had gone up to something like 18%, and none of this helped reduce inflation. What actually did end the inflation was when the U.S. deregulated the price of natural gas, which then constituted a competition to oil, and thus we had less inflation.
Boom. The magic money tree. The current GDP of the U.S. is about $20 trillion. Perhaps dumping in a couple million here or there might have little impact on overall inflation. But that is not what is being proposed. MMT advocates, such as Stephanie Kelton, argue that MMT offers a way to fund multi-trillion-dollar programs such as a jobs guarantee and universal health care. The $32 trillion estimated cost of Medicare for all is the equivalent of 160% of current GDP. It is beyond belief that the Federal Reserve could pump that much money into the economy without serious inflation. Well, the Federal Reserve isn't the one pumping. So, yeah, that is beyond belief.
He's looking at current GDP and then saying, so then after these future programs are multiples of current GDP, but it's kind of meaningless because GDP at that point is also going to be different. So then it's probably not going to end up being 160% of that GDP because that spending itself generates income, and then that would income by definition as part of GDP. So it's not really particularly relevant or actionable calculations that he's presenting there, in my opinion.
No.
But then on the other hand, I also agree. I'm not really into government-run healthcare, so I don't support the Medicare for all. I support the jobs guarantee because it makes sense based on the way this monetary system is designed and is supposed to work. And we've gone through that before. It may sound strange for a libertarian to support a government job guarantee, but when you understand that the government makes you unemployed by imposing a tax, then the default state of the system is unemployment. And if the government doesn't do something about it, then people won't find work. So, or at least a certain group of people or a certain number of people won't be able to find work because of lack of net private savings in the economy. So if you understand that the system works like that, then it makes sense to have a job guarantee. By the way, a federal job guarantee could probably be done for something like
1 or 2% of GDP.
Yeah, I think maybe maybe even less, or maybe something like $2 trillion or so. But just think of all the other money you could avoid spending, because you would not have unemployment. And unemployment is such a scourge on society. It causes so many problems. It literally is connected with criminality, drug abuse, domestic abuse, depression, frustration, all sorts of family issues that affect the kids, and so many things, so many programs that we wouldn't need to spend money on if we had a job guarantee, or as we prefer to call it, a transition job program, which is just a recognition of the fact that the government makes us unemployed by taxing and needs to supply a backstop to keep a certain cadre of people employed. By the way, also much more preferable to paying people for doing nothing. I think that's something everyone can get on board with. So the program is far less socialistic and welfare state type of a program than this guy and many other libertarians make it out to be, in my opinion.
And then, to be fair, the federal job guarantee ideas coming from Stephanie Kelton are they would definitely compete with the private sector, the jobs that are being offered.
I haven't read it, so sorry.
Well, I remember when Bernie Sanders came out with his, which obviously was because Stephanie Kelton is his.
Oh, because you were saying because they offer benefits and all that stuff.
Yeah, they offered like full Medicare. They started at $15 an hour, which, I mean, in Seattle, where I'm at, that minimum wage is already $15 an hour, but in some areas of the country where it's still like 10, you're competing directly with the private sector, and the entire point of the federal transition job is it can't compete with the private sector. So I could see why someone libertarian-minded would, even if they understood MMT, would look at this and say, hey, federal transition job, fine, but one of the most important points about it is it can't compete with the private sector. And just to go on what Nima was saying, how cheap this would be, the article here is putting the jobs guarantee and the universal health care package together and saying it's going to cost $32 trillion. I wish you would have broken it apart, because then we could see how much cheaper the jobs guarantee would have been compared to the universal health care. The universal health care is where all that cost is coming from. So, the last paragraph here. There is an old joke. What does a parrot have in common with the Holy Roman Empire? The parrot isn't holy, Roman, or an empire. I think there's historians who say the same thing about the Holy Roman Empire, that the Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy, Roman, or an empire.
Yeah,
but
it's a good joke.
MMT is the same. It isn't very modern, we agree. Cranks throughout history have been saying that we would be rich if we only had more of the medium of exchange. You crank, Nima.
Yeah.
It isn't monetary policy so much as a way of escaping the inevitabilities of fiscal policy. And its theoretical basis is a banal truism. It is simply the latest in a long line of claims to have found the magic money tree for government.
Well, I mean, I kind of agree that it's not modern. So at least there, I think we're on the same page. Because as you and I have discussed before, it's actually a bit of a misnomer, because it recognizes how monetary systems have been run from the very conception of monetary systems as far as we can trace back in history.
Yeah, it should probably be called ancient money theory.
It should be, yeah. If you read David Graeber's Debt the First 5,000 Years, you'll know that monetary systems where a authority imposes a tax and then spends money into existence have been around for longer than gold or silver money systems even. So it's actually just recognizing how sovereign monetary systems throughout history have always functioned.
That was by John Phelan, who is an economist at the Center of the American Experiment and a fellow of the Cobden Center. I have no idea what either of those are, but you can go look them up if you want. So, article number 2. Let's see if we can get through it a little bit quicker. Modern monetary theory and the unspoken effects of inflation. We've just never spoken about them. We didn't spend the entire last article talking about it.
Yeah, I think we have a whole podcast episode about inflation. But anyway.
If inflation leads to such negative consequences, then why do so many economists think inflation is necessary? That's actually maybe that's it. It's not as dumb as the other stuff they say.
Well, the question is, does inflation actually lead to negative consequences? You know, that's... I raise him with that question because there's actually not much evidence that inflation per se is a bad thing. Hyperinflation, of course, is bad, but regular baseline inflation isn't necessarily a particularly big problem.
There has been plenty of discussion recently on what modern monetary theory is and the negative effects this policy can have on the economy. Right out from the gate. The discussion that all these plenty of people are having is the negative effects that MMT will have on the economy. That's the discussion, Nima.
Yeah.
MMT supporters argue that the government is not constrained by how much it can tax. They argue that the government can simply print more money to finance deficits. In essence, MMT supporters are arguing for the government to create monetary inflation, an increase in the supply of money. Okay, this is a pet peeve of mine. The definition of inflation seems to slide around a lot.
Yeah.
Where it's typically used, at least to my understanding, to say that your money is buying less. Like
the aggregate price level increases.
Right. And whether or not that accompanies a increase in the actual money supply depends on whether or not you kept all things constant and raised the money supply, or kept the money supply constant and changed the other stuff. But other times, I hear it explained as it's simply the supply of money. Increasing the supply of money is the inflation.
Yeah.
So, which one is it?
Yeah, it's not really... The supply of money increases all the time, so it's not very helpful to define it that way, because it doesn't help understand the economy in any way, shape, or form.
Well, what I think it allows for is a nice setup for a fallacy of ambiguation, where you think you're talking about prices and they're actually just talking about flat money supply, so they could snicker and be like, I was right the whole time. Neener. I think that's what this setup is for.
Well, it's just, I think just important to point out, the government doesn't really increase the money supply. The money supply mostly increases because of bank lending, and yes, also because of budget deficits. So there's one lever where the government has power, but the vast majority of money in the economy is created through bank lending,
which is not controlled by the interest rate.
Yeah,
just going to have to say that over and over again.
Yeah.
Some of them, I guess these MMTers, some of them recognize that this can lead to price inflation, higher prices as measured by the consumer price index.
Now suddenly it's already...
Well, he said price inflation this time instead in monetary.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, here we go. But argue that as long as inflation is low, didn't tell me which one, there should be no problems with the government financing deficits by printing money. He said something very similar, Nima. Yet MMT supporters and many mainstream economists ignore or are not aware of two important effects of price inflation on the economy. Are you ready for these, Nima, that you haven't thought about or you ignored?
Yeah.
You've been ignoring this shit, haven't you?
So ready.
Price inflation affects different people differently.
Okay, let me guess what it's going to say. So, price inflation is caused by, if it's caused by bank lending or government spending, it benefits the entity that gets to spend the money first over those who receive the money latest, and thus constitutes a redistribution of income. All right, go.
Okay. Since price inflation is caused by an increase in the money supply, money printing, and according to MMT supporters, government should use the new money printed to fund deficits, then by definition this new money will not be distributed to everyone equally or in equal proportion with their current income. This means that some people would be able to use the new money before prices have risen, and as a consequence will benefit more than others. Damn, Nima.
Yeah. I mean, that's the standard...
Fucking prophecy. Read the prophecy.
That's the standard Austrian
go-to
cliche thinking on inflation. So, and yeah, Henry Hazlitt. I've read that book, of course. So, pretty standard milquetoast Austrian theory.
Okay, well, let's read it. Henry Hazlitt explains this in a very, very well in his book Economics in One Lesson. In his chapter, The Mirage of Inflation, Hazlitt writes, This increase in nominal income as a consequence of the newly printed money does not mean, however, that everyone's relative or absolute wealth and income will remain the same as before. On the contrary, the process of inflation is certain to affect the fortunes of one group differently from those of another. The first groups to receive additional money will benefit the most. The money incomes of Group A, for example, will have increased before prices have increased, so that they will be able to buy almost a proportionate increase in goods. The money incomes of Group B will advance later when prices have already increased somewhat, but Group B will also be better off in terms of goods. Meanwhile, however, the groups that still have no advance whatever in their money income will find themselves compelled to pay higher prices for the things they buy, which means that they will be obliged to get along on a lower standard of living than before. So,
Well,
what's your argument that
well, in reality, you constantly have workers renegotiating their wages, and in some cases maybe they are missing out, but in the long term, you always see you see wages go up alongside inflation. So it's not necessarily true that income earners are left behind because of inflation. I would say it can be for a little while, but it's not really. It's not like there's a system where one entity deliberately exploits another group by producing inflation. It's rather that inflation is just part of the monetary system and the banking system as we have it these days. We've discussed before that inflation, at least according to the MMT scholars that I've read, inflation is mostly caused by, in a full employment economy, it's caused by deficit spending plus investment spending plus the export surpluses. And it's not that the money supply going up per se leads to inflation, because the money supply could also go up when the Federal Reserve purchases government securities, which doesn't produce any new spending. It just constitutes a private sector asset swap. So, there are certain factors that can drive up inflation, but they're not necessarily the money supply. And prices are representative of market conditions. So if investment spending goes up, for example, then that means that workers are employed in a project that produces a machine that's not available to consumers, but yet they earn income that will appear as purchasing power on the market for consumer goods. By the way, Carol Quigley in Tragedy and Hope, and also I'm just reading, I'm past halfway through on the evolution of civilizations, and he pretty intuitively understands this process. And you may have remember him writing about how there is certain type of investment spending, for example, that appears as full purchasing power on the market, but doesn't produce any goods that are available on the consumer market. So that's just, but on the other hand, they produce goods that are available on the business market, and they're purchased by businesses, machinery, computers, etc. Those in the long run could once again drive prices down a little bit, but then there's always projects that fail. So to have inflation is almost a necessity of the market process, if you look at it this way. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that prices reflect market conditions. And it's kind of funny to me, there's a lot of these libertarians who say that inflation is a bad thing. Prices must not go up. They have to stay at a certain level or fall or whatever it is that they want them to do. But it's more like the prices just adjust to market conditions. And if market conditions are such, someone invests in machinery and withdraws labor from the market to do that, and then pays them to purchase consumer goods, and that purchasing power appears on the market without having added new consumer goods, then that can cause some inflation. But that's the whole point of it, right? The prices are supposed to signal to individuals what supply and demand conditions on the market are.
Boom. Moving on. In addition to this, it should be noticed that price inflation, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, does not capture how...
And by the way, sorry to interrupt. By the way, same for export surplus, right? If you have foreigners buying up your goods, new money comes into the economy, and goods are leaving the economy, then that needs to be expressed in prices somewhere. So unless you don't want entrepreneurs to react appropriately, but that's what we want, right? We want the market to be flexible and to react to market conditions. That's why we have prices, and that's why sometimes prices go up, sometimes they go down. But it's all based on market conditions, not necessarily one force behind it driving it all.
All right. In addition to this, it should be noted that price inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index does not capture how price increases affect everyone. Consumer Price Index measures how much prices change on average, since it is based on an average basket of goods and services. For example, food in the Consumer Price Index calculation accounts for about 13% of the basket, but not all Americans spend 13% on food. People with low income spend more than 13%, and those with more income spend much less than this. One cannot expect Jeff Bezos and a retiree to spend the same portion of their income on food. This means that inflation is different for different groups of people, and this is another way we can see how different groups of people are affected differently by it.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, it's definitely true that inflation is tricky to really measure ultimately. I don't disagree with that. The CPI is a method. Nobody's saying that it's the perfect method. There's also a PPI, which is the Producer Price Index, and it's supposed to be an average, right? It's not supposed to. It by definition, it can't represent every individual's situation. It can't tell you how much prices have gone up for things that Jeff Bezos spends money on, and the average worker at the same time. So that's not really the purpose of these figures, but they're just to give us an average approximation of what's going on. But in the end, yeah, I totally agree that it's pretty hard to measure inflation, and I personally think for that reason we shouldn't really worry about it all that much. But that's just me.
Inflation distorts the structure of the economy. This may be hard to understand for those who subscribe to MMT and Keynesians in general, since for them all that matters is aggregate demand, the total amount of goods and services demanded. Yet since inflation comes from an increase in the supply of money, it affects different industries differently. The new money that is printed will not be distributed equally to all industries. Instead, it will first go into some industries and later to others. This is kind of the same.
Well, but once again, I just want to point out here that the new money that's printed will not be distributed equally. Of course not, right? I mean, if I get a loan to build a factory, then I hire workers and I pay my workers to build the factory, and those workers will appear on the marketplace and buy consumer goods, and assuming full employment and assuming this is happening in aggregate in larger amounts and numbers, then that by definition doesn't occur equally everywhere. It's by definition this group of workers whom I've paid to build this factory that appears on the consumer goods market as purchasing power. And so, of course, it's not evenly distributed. But also, adding to that, we're always assuming, or at least he's assuming, full employment. If there's no full employment of resources, then you don't really see. You don't necessarily have to see inflation just because there's new money appearing on the market, appearing in the private sector or in the economy.
Going on. So I guess we're going to quote from Hazlitt's Mirage of Inflation again. Even a relatively mild inflation distorts the structure of production. It leads to the overexpansion of some industries at the expense of others. This involves a misapplication and waste of capital. When the inflation collapses or is brought to a halt, the misdirected capital investment, whether in the form of machines, factories, or office buildings, cannot yield an adequate return and loses a greater part of its value.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like the Austrian business cycle theory. And The problem once again, even a relatively mild inflation distorts the structure of production. This is somehow assuming that inflation is a
culprit.
Is an exogenous force that just shows up and distorts the market by itself. But inflation is really just a measurement of prices. So, I mean, if he wants to make the case that investment spending distorts the structure of production, well, sure it does. That's what investment spending does. It introduces new facts of production to the economy. So, of course, it distorts the structure of production. Is it a bad thing necessarily? I don't think so. Or export surpluses. Maybe they distort the structure of production because there's less goods available, fewer goods are available to our domestic buyers because they're being bought up by foreign buyers. Sure, that distorts the structure of production. It needs to be expressed in the form of prices, so it leads to inflation. So I think the entire understanding of what inflation is and how it operates is not accurate in the way that these Austrian economists are looking at it, and it's much more a symptom of other things that are not necessarily a bad thing, in my opinion. But so, if you read the sentence, even a relatively mild inflation distorts the structure of production. So where is the structure of production not distorted? Tell me the level.
This kind of goes back to what we were talking about yesterday.
Tell me the exact price level that is the correct price level at which there's no distortion.
Things were perfect and then you touched it.
Right, but that answering that question defies the entire concept of a free market, right? You don't know what the price level needs to be at any given point in time. But for some reason, these people assume that no, prices need to not go up at all, and I think they also say that deflation is a natural state of the economy, which is what a lot of Austrians and libertarians believe. So prices should really be going down. Okay, how much? By how much? So maybe prices are going down, but they're going down less than they should have, in your view. So I'm just trying to convey what a challenge it even is to measure inflation and to look and to declare proper price levels, etc. I don't think that that's how it works, and it's not really something that you can come to an agreement on. You know, it sort of transposes the entire discussion to an emotional conversation where inflation is bad. You don't want inflation, so let's not have any deficits. Let's not have any bank lending. We'll
just not have any money. Fuck it.
Not have any money. Yeah. We'll just exchange gold tokens or coins, even though that's never how any monetary system in the history of mankind has really functioned, except in some in certain emergency situations among certain groups of people, maybe. But generally speaking, it's just not how the system functions.
Moving on, because we're getting a little long here. This is exactly what happened during the housing bubble. After the 2001 recession, the Fed increased the money supply in order to lower interest rates and stimulate the economy. Is that how it works, Nima? They increase the money supply in order to lower interest rates?
Yeah, I guess.
Kind of, sort of.
Well, you could say so because to lower interest rates, they have to buy treasury bills, and that injects reserves and replaces treasury bills on the bank's balance sheets with reserves. And if the price for the treasury bills goes up, then the interest rate by definition goes down. Actually, then later on they started to just outright paying interest on reserves. So that's has the same effect, it's just a different method of achieving the same result. And yeah, they did do it to stimulate the economy because it's what they think they're doing when they lower interest rates. You and I, we don't really agree that is the case. But that's their particular belief, their religion, if you will, that lowering interest rates stimulates the economy and raising them somehow cools the economy.
this led to an overexpansion of the housing industry.
Yeah, actually,
poor underwriting was one of the.
That's the root cause of the housing crisis was poor underwriting and pretty much non-existent lending standards, where people could just state their income and the banks would just take that at face value and lend accordingly. Stated income loans. Liar loans were about 60 to 70% of all loans made at the peak, I believe, in 2006, 2007. And I don't really want to look at the interest rate chart right now, but I believe if we did, then that would also show that the housing crisis started far sooner, and the bad loans were made far sooner than when the Fed cut the interest rates.
Yeah.
You know, it's a situation of correlation doesn't always equal causation.
Now, since resources were limited, this new money started to lead to higher prices, at which point the Fed interfered by increasing their target interest rates. The federal
in this particular case, because the lending standards were so lax, and the loans made based on nothing introduced new money into the economy, and then that new money led to higher housing prices.
Well, and then let's not forget one of the most important points of...
But it's not that the Fed, it's not that the banks loan money because the Fed lowered the interest rates. The banks loan money because lending standards were eroding over time. And also, as Minsky has written, as we've discussed in our excellent series on why Minsky matters, just to plug that here, the private sector has a tendency to go from less riskier to more risky funding structures, the least risky being the hedge, where everything is covered, and then the next stage being the speculative position, and then finally the worst position being the Ponzi position.
One thing I want to point out about real estate prices, and this is something I've noticed after doing a bit of real estate myself, is that your agent has every incentive in the world to argue that your real estate is worth more this time around. Because, first of all, they're trying to get you as much money as possible, and second of all, the higher the price, the more commission that they're going to make. And I'm just watching the way that real estate agents do this more and more. It's always this game of, what are the comparables doing, and how can I argue that this house that would have been worth $325,000 a few months ago is actually worth $365,000 now? And then how do I get not the inspector, but the appraiser to agree with that? And how do I get the bank to accept that appraisal? And because you and I know that when a person gets a loan, it has nothing to do with how much money the bank, how many cash reserves the bank has on hand. That the money is just created out of nowhere. And if people are able to liar loan, coupled with the fact that real estate agents are just like, yeah, let's let's try to get this as high as possible for my seller and for my commission. And of course the mortgage brokers give it his thumbs up, because every time a mortgage is made, he makes a bunch of money. Everybody is in on this, going, yeah, make it as expensive as possible, because we're all just like high on all the commissions going on. And the buyer, from what I've seen, buyers will give up their last pair of underwear to get into a home. Like, they will scrape together every last dime and, anything that they could possibly fudge and make up on their credit report or their statement or anything to get into a home. So if you take away the limiting factor from them, which is like, hey, prove your income, and they're allowed to make up whatever fucking number they want, and no one's going to tell them no in the whole process, of course you're going to have all the prices go skyrocketing. Yeah. It's got nothing to do with the amount of money in supply.
Yeah, the money supply is it goes up as well as these loans are made, but it's
Correct.
an after effect. It's not a root cause of anything.
That's a really good point. That's a super good point. It's an after effect.
Yeah. It's not the Fed injecting money that the banks then go and lend out just because some money suddenly fell in their laps. And by the way, I can confirm that the lending standards these days are a lot stricter, because I'm currently in the process of buying a condo and I'm financing a little part of it. And I mean, everything has to be documented. There's no stated income anymore, it seems.
Yeah, especially because you're self-employed. I'm sure they want to shove a probe up your ass.
Yeah, something like that.
Anyway, rant over. At this point, moving on, it becomes apparent that many people had made bad investments and that this is what was happening. Well, excuse me. At this point, it became apparent that many people had made bad investments and that what was happening was unsustainable. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like what I just said. It should also be noted here that it is not clear where the new money will go. This depends on the market conditions, including government regulations at the time the new money is printed. Not really sure why they threw that in at the end. So, Nima, why do MMTers and mainstream economists like inflation?
I don't know. Let's see what he tells us, why we like it.
If inflation leads to such consequences, then why do so many economists think inflation is necessary? Because necessary and like are the same fucking thing. First, most economists do not see the effects of inflation as described above. In mainstream economics, inflation is just assumed to be neutral, meaning it only affects nominal, I don't know why I can never say that word, nominal income. I fucked it up again, I'm just going to move on. Which are incomes not adjusted for inflation, and does not affect real incomes. Because of this, these economists do not see any of the effects of inflation described above as problematic. In fact, they do not even recognize these problems. Everyone who has seen a textbook on inflation knows this.
Well, once again, we've already established that inflation is not a autonomous actor on the economy. So he keeps on focusing on the inflation itself, and it's not really how it works. And there are many different causes to inflation, and you have to examine them closely. And depending on what they are, it may make sense to do something or not about that inflation.
Now, to be fair, most of these economists see that some people can benefit and others will lose, but this is not for the reason explained above. On the other hand, most mainstream textbooks completely ignore the destructive effects of inflation in the structure of production. They do not believe inflation can change the structure of production, but as it is explained above, this is inevitable.
Yeah, and as we discussed, the structure of production changes all the time, so I'm not sure why that's...
Yeah,
how that's established, that's a bad thing, that the structure of production changes, but anyway.
Second, while most mainstream economists have expressed concerns about MMT, 97% agree, they agree with MMT supporters that some inflation is important for a healthy economy. The argument here is that inflation makes it less expensive to borrow, which will lead to more investments. Deflation, these economists argue, is destructive to the economy because it makes it harder for borrowers to repay their loans since the prices of the products decrease. Yet businessmen do not need inflation to help pay for their loans. What? So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, Nima. It is true that inflation benefits the borrower and deflation benefits the creditor.
Yeah.
Right?
Which is why banks regularly push for austerity, and which is why banks imposed the gold standard a century or so ago. It's because deflation tends to benefit those with fixed incomes, and inflation not so much. So these are all effects now that we're discussing: inflation, deflation, who benefits and who doesn't. I I'm not sure if he's introducing any new thoughts or ideas here, but
well, I want to see his contrary point here. He says, yet businessmen do not need inflation to help pay for their loans. All they need is to be able to estimate the cost of production, including repaying loans, and the revenue they will receive. In addition to this, all they need is to be able to estimate the cost of production, including repaying loans, and revenue that they will receive. But if it's deflationary, then their estimates were off, and their profits are going to go down, and they won't be able to pay the loan because they weren't able to estimate that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Some of them will default if there's deflation, yeah.
In addition to this, most economists today believe there exists an... by the way, I would be super happy if everything got cheaper. Well, for me, personally, if things get cheaper and my money goes farther than I'm currently making, I think that's great. However, what we're doing here is we're trying to look at the macro situation and how this is operating for everybody. And as Nima pointed out, it's not necessarily a bad thing that there's a certain amount of baseline inflation, and it may be the result of natural market forces within this government money structure that we have.
Yeah.
Going on, and this is the last paragraph, by the way. In addition to this, most economists today believe that most economists today bullshit. Stop with the mass appeal fallacies. In addition to this, most economists today believe there exists an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. That is to say, they believe inflation can help lower unemployment. Well, I guess if we're strictly defining inflation as the money supply, yes. This is known as the Phillips curve, and not everyone agrees that this relationship exists or that the inflation causes unemployment to decrease. Regardless of what the reasons in favor of inflation are, we must not ignore the disastrous effects it has on the economy.
Yeah, so once again, it's inflation is a symptom, and there can be many causes, some desirable, some not. So I think that's really, in my opinion, that's the big takeaway from this. He tries to hone in on and discuss inflation as a beast of its own, whereas I'm saying you have to examine the precise workings and the precise causes of the inflation. And in some cases, like in Zimbabwe, the collectivization of the land led to hyperinflation. So let's not do that. Let's not do collectivism-style land reform. So it's sort of how I would look at it. But looking at the inflation itself is not helpful and not meaningful and kind of useless in understanding the path forward for policy.
Yep. And that was by Klaj D. Bregu, who is an assistant professor of economics at IU South Bend's Judd Layton School of Business and Economics. Link of the article will be in the description below. So well, hey, Nima, I gotta say, these two articles were at least a little bit better than the other ones we've gone over so far. I will give them that. They are a little bit better.
Yeah, they have some points here and there, and on MMT we fundamentally disagree, but that's fine. That doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean,
everyone disagrees.
It wasn't like the monkey with typewriter horseshit that we were.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe FEE got such horrendous feedback that they're now trying to pump up their numbers. Their rookie numbers. I don't know.
Cool. Well, I think we covered those adroitly, and we will be seeing...
By the way, if the price of Bitcoin increases, is that inflation?
Ooh.
Cliffhanger for next time.
Ooh. All right. With that, this has been Amagi. I'm Dylan Moore with the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and that over there is Nima Majur of economicsjunkie.com. And this has been the 29th episode of Amagi, and we will be seeing you next time. Thanks for listening.